very hot topic in Pennsylvania.
15 people spending life behind bars will look to have their sentences commuted.
In Pennsylvania, we're really an outlier as far as the huge number of people who are serving life without parole in general and in comparison to our larger prison population.
No single factor imperils the character of our society, our Commonwealth, as much as crime.
Tough on crime policy is nationwide, right? It's worked in a lot of states for a long time. The difference between Pennsylvania and a lot of other states is many states have rolled back these really punitive measures that were passed in the 80s and 90s. Pennsylvania is not.
Pennsylvania is one of only 6 states in which there is no parole option for people serving life. So life means life.
In Pennsylvania, of course, a life sentence is a life sentence. You die in prison. You're what some people say, buried alive.
Why would I want this man that took my brother's life to rot in prison, let alone even be executed? It's not gonna bring my brother back. Everyone deserves a second chance.
Pennsylvania has what's called the felony murder rule, which says if you are involved in a felony and a homicide is committed, you can be charged and convicted of that homicide even if you didn't take part in it, even if you were just there, even if you were the getaway driver. So what that means is we have about a quarter of the people serving a life sentence, a mandatory life sentence, in the state of Pennsylvania who have never committed murder.
John Fetterman has bragged about all the murderers that he has pardoned. Yet Philadelphia has got the highest murder rate ever.
You know, you were sitting in a getaway car, had no idea what was happening. You should die in prison along with the person who pulled the trigger. I don't believe that we should.
The only way that people can come home other than exoneration is through the commutation process.
The change to the state constitution in 1994 created the situation where commutation is almost impossible to get. Perhaps even more importantly, it's a fragile system because it's a political system. One election can shut down commutation. What we need is a consistent policy that provides people the opportunity to make their case for coming home. I think if you want to understand tough on crime policies in Pennsylvania, there's 2 things that you really need to think about. The first is the district attorney and the apparatus of the district attorney's office in Philadelphia was particularly punitive. We had a district attorney back then, Lynn Abraham, who led an office that increased the number of life sentences several-fold.
And that's what we are dealing with every day, the meanness, the unspeakable violence, the predatory criminals with guns.
Including a huge increase in the number of felony murder convictions and a large increase in the number of juvenile lifers.
Over time, the population of people serving life without parole continued to grow to the point where now there are over 5,400 people serving life without parole in Pennsylvania.
The second thing you need to know about understanding tough on crime policy in Pennsylvania is the Reginald McFadden case. Reginald McFadden was a juvenile lifer who was convicted of homicide when he was under 18. Commutation Board voted 4-1 to commute his sentence. 2 years later, he went on a killing spree. After that, commutation was shut down and has been shut down really since then.
We are here today to encourage all Pennsylvanians to vote in favor of the constitutional amendment that says no pardon or commutation shall be granted unless there's a 5-0 vote, a unanimous vote. The proposed amendment is specifically designed to make it more difficult for convicted murderers, those who are sentenced to death or life in prison, to receive a pardon or commutation and get out of prison.
That totally ground the process to a halt.
Dozens and dozens, hundreds of people were commuted through the 1970s and early 1980s. That stopped after Reginald McFadden. And the decision to stop that has been bipartisan. Is Reginald McFadden the example of what happens when you start letting people out of prison? What we know is that he's not. And there's all kinds of ways we know that, right? So, for example, in Pennsylvania, we have had the most juvenile lifers of any state in the country.
We are back now with some developing news from the Supreme Court.
Monday, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down some mandatory life sentences without parole as cruel and unusual punishment.
Montgomery made it so that in Pennsylvania, the 500 juvenile lifers had to be resentenced. Just looking at the juvenile lifers who've come home in Pennsylvania over the last few years, the recidivism rate was almost zero, less than 1%.
So we know, based on evidence, that Reginald McFadden is an outlier. Yet we still use cases like that to create policy that doesn't work.
Over the years, I have listened to many victims of crime. They, more than anyone, know the cost of crime in lost income, in lost days, months, and years of their lives, in lost health, and in the loss of that sense of safety, which most of us never have occasion to challenge or to feel the loss of.
An argument that's often used in creating tough on crime policies is that we are providing some healing for victims' families, those who've been harmed. Some people who've lost loved ones to homicide, they want long prison sentences. But many don't.
What most people want are answers, more safety coming out of that. But all our system gives people is nothing or life without parole. And that's not a real choice.
Because unlike her, I do know the gentleman. And today I'm fighting just as hard for his freedom as I am for the freedom of my own child. Because I used to wake up angry and hating everybody. Today I wake up loving life, and I'm gonna live life the way I'm supposed to live life. Because bitter and anger and hatred, it doesn't eat up the person that took the life. It eats you up. So when we learn to wake up and love ourselves and love those that hurt us, this world's turning to become a better world. The system plays people on their emotions and their feelings. So if they can keep you hating that person that murdered your loved one, that's where they want to keep you at. Because as long as they have people incarcerated, they're making their money. This is all political and all about money. You can keep that young man in there 1,000 years. That's not gonna bring my brother back. Is that gonna give me satisfaction because he took my brother's life, then let him rot in jail? No. My brother was the type of guy that he didn't take mess from nobody. He wasn't scared of nobody. I could have been at the end of the world, and if he needed me, he knew exactly how to find me, where to find me. And he was always so good to us, my younger brother. Believe it or not, I was happy that day. I remember I was driving a little Toyota, and I was only around the corner from my mom's house. My brother's girlfriend had stopped me. Boy, when she told me that they killed my brother, I lost it. Finally, I went home, and the minute I saw my mom and my sisters in them, I hated everybody. I hated the world because of the pain I was feeling. and we started going to court. It's one thing for somebody to tell you your brother's dead. It's another thing when you go to court and you hear exactly how it happened. I wanted him to die. I wanted his mother to feel what my mother was feeling. I wanted his family to hurt like we were hurting. I really got deep into drugs then. I woke up every day not wanting to live. I woke up every day hating everybody, just being angry and bitter. I didn't like who I had became. The day that I really in my heart said, Lord, I forgive that guy for killing my brother. I forgive him. That was the day that I started living again. Life mattered. You know, and in life, you have to forgive to be forgiven. And I'm glad that I've forgiven this man. And that was only God preparing me. Preparing me to deal with my son getting incarcerated.
Mommy lost. Mommy, turn around.
Your hair.
Who's this? Can you remember? I'm trying to see by mommy.
And I always tell him to put it in the back. Porque mi camisa blanca, remember?
All right, so it's within 5 years or so.
Yeah, within 5 years.
Her glasses.
And this is that time too. This is years. Yeah. No, that's 4th generation there. This was before he even. This is over 27 years. 16.
Oh wow.
15, 16. But look, can you say? Uncle Bobby and nephew Philip.
You don't have to.
This is before he went to prison.
Look, guess what?
2 years before he went to prison.
Wow.
Right there.
One thing I don't call him is Photo. I call him Philip. Yeah. Oh my God, he got on my nerves so bad that I can remember one time, and Jackie, my sister, is a witness. I wanted to kill him with a bat because he tried on a pair of one of my new sneakers and went out to the street with it. And I was looking for my sneakers. I was like, where are my sneakers? Where are my sneakers? Here he come around the corner with my new sneakers on. I wanted to kill him. So he was just like an annoying brother, opposed to being a nephew.
Yeah.
So yeah, he was a good kid. Somebody that just got caught up, and you know, he was good. Sorry.
Growing up in my neighborhood, our whole block was ran by a drug dealer. Now, everyone was a part of that business. And the guy that was like the main drug dealer of the neighborhood, like he looked out for everyone on the block. In the summertime, he would get us all together and like take us all to Doney Park, pay for everything. All we had to do was pay basically for our food. Taking now, looking at that, it was like basically we were getting groomed at a young age. And then I started hanging with the older guys in the neighborhood, had me by a few years, and they was more into the stick-up game. They was more into the, why would we sell the drugs and put ourselves in jeopardy when we could just let them do all the work and then just go rob them for it. So it went from being the lookout to getting the bundles of weed from the stash house to the workers, to being the worker, to being a stick-up kid. I'm looking like, what the hell just happened? And I'm looking at Corey. He got the same look I got. But we all knew Jonathan shot this guy for sure. So I'm like, oh hell, what we do now? The first week of being incarcerated when I was in the county jail, I had a dream that I attended his funeral, crying, telling him I didn't mean to be involved in that. And to this day, it still makes my hair stand.
If I could trade places, I would, in a heartbeat. He never had a chance, not even as a kid, because he had an addict for a mother. So his chances were already cut. But I've always loved him, even through my addiction. I've always loved my kid.
She blames herself for my situation. And I try to tell her not to. But I get where it's coming from for her.
In Miss Dee Dee's son's case, because Photo was involved in this robbery, in this felony, he was charged with second-degree murder. And then second-degree murder is felony murder.
Pennsylvania has what's called the felony murder rule, which says if you are involved in a felony and a homicide is committed, you can be charged and convicted of that homicide even if you didn't take part in it, even if you were just there, even if you were the getaway driver.
First and second-degree murder both have life without parole as the mandatory minimum sentence. So that means there's nothing less you can get than that if you're convicted of first or second degree.
So what that means is we have about a quarter of the people serving a life sentence, a mandatory life sentence, in the state of Pennsylvania who have never committed murder.
The only way that people can come home other than exoneration is through the commutation process.
So I've talked to politicians in prisons around the state when they visited, and they've said, we have a process. Commutation is the process, right? It's working. Look, people are getting out of prison. But they haven't really thought beyond that.
The commutation process takes years.
And it's so based on luck. It is a process that is so difficult to navigate that men and women in prison need outside consultants to get them through that process.
And so it's still statistically incredibly difficult for someone to actually get out through the commutation process, but it's also the only option people have.
Perhaps even more importantly, it's a fragile system because it's a political system. The head of the Board of Pardons is the Lieutenant Governor. The Attorney General sits on the Board of Pardons. Both of those are elected officials. So this system is fragile in that one election can shut down commutation. It's not a viable system going forward. Some people say that these men and women should never be let out of prison. They killed someone, so why would we let them out? But research has shown that people change over time.
The vast majority of people who commit crimes, who harm people, it's young people. And really we're seeing those numbers drop off dramatically as people get older.
I wish the system would realize that if a person doesn't change in 5 years being incarcerated, that person's not going to change. But if you see that the person that went in 5 years ago is not that same person you see in there today, stop judging them for the crime that they did way back when.
Research tells us that people age out of crime. That if released, they are highly, highly unlikely to ever commit another crime.
There really isn't any sort of public safety reason to lock people up until they die.
Lord, please multiply this offering for the building up of your kingdom. Amen. After this selection, the next voice you'll hear is from Sister Lorraine Hall, who'll be delivering today's word, freedom from captivity. Amen.
So I'm going to finish my sermon with a story. And the story I'm going to tell you was given to me by my son, who's an insider. It was late and I was tired, waiting to go to sleep. But God wanted to talk. But his question made me restless. Where on earth does man keep his priceless treasures and valuables? Usually these treasures like gold, silver, diamonds, and precious jewels are locked up somewhere out of sight. God spoke, like man, my most valuable treasures on earth are also locked up. Jesus then began walking in and touching the incarcerated. Many being touched instantly began to have a golden glow come over them. God spoke to me. There's the gold. Others had a silver glow around them. God said, there's the silver. And like slow motion, they began to grow into what appeared to be giant knights in armor. I heard God to say to these warriors, now go and take what Satan has taught you and use it against him. They crossed the enemy's line and started delivering many of God's people from the clutches of Satan. Who are these people? The people that nobody knew. The rejects of society. Street people. The outcasts. The poor. The despised. And the incarcerated. These were the treasures that were missing from my house.
This is a particularly tough time to talk about letting people out of prison. The homicide rate in Philadelphia last year was as high as it's ever been. So a lot of people are asking, how is it possible that you're asking now for people to be let out of prison when there is a homicide a day in the city? I guess my response to that would be, there's no evidence that shows longer prison sentences reduce crime. In fact, I would argue that letting these folks who have been in prison a long time, 20, 30, 40 years, who have spent most of their adult lives counseling younger people, would be a benefit to this crime situation that we find ourselves in now.
My focus is my family and my grandchildren. I then have the opportunity to raise my children physically. But this gives me a chance at least to help raise my grandchildren physically. My grandmother's 91. I want to be able to take care of her and spend time with her. I want to be on the forefront for the guys that were left behind. If they need me to speak on behalf of lifers, people that's incarcerated, because the more it is, the better it is.
We get emotional because he was so young when it happened to him, you know, when that incident happened. He didn't have a chance. But we know the God that we serve today. Yes. And we know that one day he will be sitting around his table.
We're in the habit where we tell him, yeah, when you come home, it's not if you come home. When you come home, we're going to do this and we're going to go here. We far from perfect, but we strive to live our life how God wants us to live our life, you know. And I can say that for a person that's been incarcerated 27 years, he should have been filled with anger and bitterness, and he's not. To talk to him, you would think, man, he been in here this long? Because he doesn't sound angry, he don't talk loud, you know, he doesn't hold animosity or anything, so. And that's the kind of heart God looks for.
No one's asking that the doors of the prison be thrown open and everybody gets to come home.
To actually look at these people as individuals is really all that we're asking for. But we're saying that at this point we aren't even giving people the opportunity to show that they've changed, that they've turned their lives around.
And what people are asking for is a change in policy that provides parole options.
There we go. Mom, go ahead.
An incarcerated individual at SCI Smithfield. This call is not private. It will be recorded and may be monitored. If you believe this should be a private call, please hang up and follow facility instructions. To register this number as a private number, to accept this free call, press 1. To refuse this free, thank you for using Securus. You may start the conversation now.
We usually do this when we in
He
the
said,
car.
he said, y'all got the 4 amigas here?
Yes.
The 4 amigas and the little amigos is here?
And we not in the car.
I heard all the echo and I was like, what?
You said 1, right? And you got nothing.
Clean up. What I messed up. What I messed up. I start my life over again. I gotta clean up. I gotta clean up. What I messed up. What I messed up. I'm gonna start my life over again. I made up my mind. I ain't running no more. I'm going back to church. I'm gonna walk right through the door. I gotta clean up. I gotta clean up. What I messed up. What I messed up. I'm starting my life over again. I gotta clean up. I gotta clean up. What I messed up. What I messed up. I'm gonna start my life over again. Those of you that feel like I do, let's do better. Can't make it through the door.
Well, thank you so much for viewing that with us. There's always something powerful about hearing someone else's story and being able to kind of bear witness to their journey a little bit. So we appreciate that. And before we kind of introduce the panelists, I just want to see if anyone wants to share some thoughts about kind of reflections or maybe what they felt from seeing that movie. And then please understand that there is no expectation that we all have the same point of view or the same experience or the same thoughts about it, but we want to be able to have a discussion. So anybody want to raise their hand or type in the chat to just kind of share some initial thoughts of first viewing that and what you thought. Yeah, I see that Dr. Jones is going to log off for a minute, log back in to see if she can't get better sound. Anyone else have some thoughts they want to share? All right, everybody's on the shy side. And I think some of our panelists, they looks like they're all coming here, just waiting for Dr. Jones to log back in. But before she does that, we'll go ahead and introduce some of the other, there she is, great. We'll introduce all the panelists. And what I'm going to ask you to do is just introduce yourself and explain to the audience kind of who you are, what work you do, and kind of what brings you to this space. We'll start with Roxanne from Straight Ahead, who is sponsoring this event along with OVA. Roxanne, please introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here. Like Suzanne said, I'm over at Straight Ahead, and Straight Ahead, we do a lot of advocacy around prisons, and I'm the legislative director over at Straight Ahead. And mainly what I've been doing for the last few years is advocating actually for legislation to end death by incarceration, also known as life without parole. And, part of our work is engaging with survivors and victims because you can't separate these issues. And this is why we're here today. We want to intentionally engage with all of you and have a conversation, like Suzanne said. And I also, on a personal level, my fiance is somebody who was convicted of death by incarceration and is currently home and got through the commutation process. And so I can speak to that a bit personally as well. So that's me.
Thank you so much and welcome. Rakia.
How you doing, everybody? My name is Rakia Lindsay. I also work with Straight Ahead. I'm the survivor justice advocate. I organize a group of impacted people called the Survivor Justice Network. I'm what is referred to as a dual survivor, like Miss Dee, who you saw in the No Way Home film. I'm on both sides of it. So I have lost loved ones to violence, and I do have a loved one who is currently serving not a life sentence, but a virtual life sentence. He was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison for a violent crime. And so I come to the work with that perspective of understanding both sides, as well as living in a community where I am forced to face the root causes that lead people to have these violent experiences. It's statistically proven that people's first experience with violence is often not being violent themselves. And so it is through patterns of violence that are either, exposed or personally experienced that oftentimes is what leads people to violence. And then the reality of living in an impoverished neighborhood, we know that poverty is another one of the leading drivers for violent behavior and activity. So I come to the work with all of those perspectives in mind, and I organize other people who have been impacted by violence, but understand that we will never get to where we want to be, which is safety, by only thinking about police and prisons. And we have those and they function as they do, but to get to true public safety, we need to be really delving into what else we can be doing in our communities, and how else our legislators can advocate for us in a way that will actually get us to prevention, which is true public safety.
Thank you so much. Just your points bring out again how it's so important that we're having this conversation during the National Crime Victims' Rights Week, looking at options and services, how we can help and what else we can do to really bring about some change. So thank you for that. Dr. Jones, please introduce yourself, or Reverend Jones, I'm sorry.
I answer to all things.
Okay.
And I am both a Philadelphia pastor in West Philadelphia and executive director of the Metropolitan Christian Council. And we're the catalyst behind the Restorative Cities movement, where we advocate around restorative justice and also do popular education around restorative justice in our communities so that our communities understand and join in advocating for restorative justice as opposed to retributive justice. I am been married for 46 years, and we have raised 6 children, 5 guys and 1 girl, and of the 6, 4 are biological, 2 are foster care, 1 is deceased. And I've definitely twice been I am a two-time survivor of crime, one violent, one property. And statistically, we're like most families in the hood. Of our children, we have one child who was incarcerated very unjustly and found to be unjustly, unfair sentencing. And he was in and out based on that for about 20 years, I guess. He's 40 now, he's out. But every time he would start putting his life together, it was just ridiculous. And then another who was convicted of, both were convicted of felony misdemeanors. The other who was convicted in the county. And in his case, we were told that if it had happened in middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, he wouldn't have done any time. And if it had happened in Philadelphia, he would have done 3 years. But it was in the county. So he got about 6 months as a weekender, which meant he could hold on to his family and hold on to his job. And he got 9 years on the egg walk, tightrope, whatever of probation. But it's just interesting how the experience with incarceration also further victimizes families and people all at the same time. So I guess from many angles, experiencing the injustice of criminal systems and the injustice of retributive systems. But we are all here doing what we can to change it. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for being here and what you do to bring about those changes that we need. I haven't seen if Miss Dee Dee has hopped on, and that's fine if she hasn't.
Yeah, I don't think she has. She was, taking a quiz, and I think she'll join after. And hopefully she'll give us a call if she has trouble logging on. So.
All righty, good. So how about one or two or each of you give us a little bit more background on what the term dual survivor. What do you mean by that? Who wants to start?
So when we use the term dual survivor, it's really meant to point out the fact that we think about being a victim in a sense of losing or a survivor in a sense of losing someone most of the time to extraordinary situations like murder or I was at the OVA rally earlier this week, and the woman spoke about losing her son to distracted driving. So that's one way that we understand loss and we think about loss, and that's one form of survivorship. But then there is the reality that when a loved one is incarcerated, especially when that loved one is incarcerated for 20, 30, 40 life, that is also a deep loss, right? Oftentimes the people who are lost to these lengthy or permanent sentences are breadwinners for their family. So those are children who don't have that parent, they're active. Those are, children and loved ones who, although, yes, they are still living in a sense, the quality of life is extremely different, right? And the access to that person is now based on, the confinement of how you can interact within the system. I did a restorative circle yesterday inside of SCI Phoenix. And with being there, with a group, there were so many things, so many barriers that a few of us almost didn't make it in, right? Your pants have rips in it, you have on tights, so you have on shorts, right? Not to mention the fact that Phoenix, I believe, is the closest state prison in Pennsylvania to Philadelphia. So proximity, that's an hour and a half away. Most of these jails are 3, 4+ hours. And so it's difficult when you think about elderly loved ones or young children. and that process of like being able to actually get people up there. During the pandemics, there were no in-person visits, right? And so again, although it is not a physical permanent loss of life, um, your loved ones aren't with you during the holidays. It's just it's it's a drastic change in the way that people are allowed to access and interact with their family members. And again, although some of these people who are serving these sentences have done some very terrible things, because I also, again, love to point out the fact that there are people serving, death by incarceration sentences who are innocent. And so these families are missing their loved one based on, whatever the judiciary process was that, ended up with an innocent person serving these sentences. So when we say dual survivor, we're acknowledging the very severe and extreme loss that comes with losing someone who actually loses their life. But also the extreme loss and hurt and the impact that has on a family member when someone is sentenced to death by incarceration, or 20 years in prison is a lifetime, really. So just acknowledging both of those losses.
Okay. Do either of you want to add anything additional to that, or?
No, I think Rukia explained it pretty well. Like, we're talking about people who are on both sides of this dynamic, often in the same communities, right? So I just want to point out that the communities that are most impacted by violence are also the communities that are also most impacted by mass incarceration. So we're talking about a lot of the times the same communities, in poor Black communities in Philadelphia, you would be hard pressed to find someone who has not experienced both of those things at the same time, right? And so I think, just to add to that, when we hear a lot of the narratives around survivorship and victims, one type of survivor and victim is often lifted up, but I feel like this, but people who live in these communities, their stories aren't told and are often ignored.
Good point. Reverend Jones, were you going to add something?
Yeah, just definitely agreeing with everything that my sisters have said, and appreciative of this time to lift up the fact that the dual survivorship within our communities is much, much, much higher than we care to think about. And also the current and concurrent survival strengths that our community exhibits every time we go and visit, every time we go to court, every time we get that call and we know that we have to take it because the person doesn't have control over when they can get a call through. Every time we hear about a fight inside, it's constant. And when our loved ones are out, it's still constant, because every time they're pulled over by a cop, every time, it's like a constant drumbeat on the lives of our community and its families. And as a pastor of 30 years, it's hard for me to think of one family that has not been both involved in the carceral system. I can't think of one. And I can go to all the ages, from the babies to the grannies. So it just says something about this heavy, heavy weight that is constant. It does not end.
A good point. And when you talk about the community trauma and what's being taken from the community, when I think back on the film, and Miss Dee said how her son didn't really have much of a chance, or started out behind because she was, dealing with addiction. And when you think about that, and then you think about the little boy at the end of the film who's singing, and how happy that little boy is, and that picture of hope that he presents, this is what we want for our communities. But then the challenge, if all the men in the community are locked up, then how does that little boy then get to, that life of hope that we want him to achieve. And I think that kind of brings us to like, this balance of what else then can we do? How else can we meet the needs? Because if what we were doing was working, then by now we should be at a different place. And since we're not, then like we said, with the national theme, what are the options, services that we can offer? What is the hope that will make things look different and help us have different results? And I think that kind of leads us to that restorative justice piece. And Reverend Jones, I'm going to ask you to define that for us, because sometimes in different spaces, you hear the word restorative justice, and sometimes people mean totally different things. So can you kind of give us a definition of what is restorative justice?
I'd like to first center the definition in 3 different terms. There's transformative justice, restorative justice, and restorative practices. So restorative practices are specific tools that people learn in order to achieve the restorative justice that is the foundation of transformative justice. So when we think about restorative justice, we want to think about the continuum. We've got people who are involved in healing and accountability with survivors of harm. And it recognizes that whoever we are today, where we might do something that hurts somebody, it's not who we are. It's what we've done. And it's bringing together the person harmed, the person who caused harm, and their supporters and community. And when all of those things come together, we have the makings of restorative justice, which says, how do we make this right? And how do we hear one another? Restorative practices helps us to do that. It's tools just to help that. It's like having a kit. Transformative justice says, okay, we are more than this harm has impacted more than 1 or 2 people. It impacts the whole community. It impacts the family. And the addressing of the harm has to also include the systems, the community, and the people. So when we look at specifically at restorative justice, we might be looking at a few people, but we're also looking at it knowing it's part of a larger system that contributes most often to harm. And it's transforming that in such a way that it supports healing. And we also always want to always remember this victim-centered. So the voices and the experiences of the people who are harmed are at the whole core of this. And those impacted are centered. We recognize that both the person who was harmed and the person who caused harm and the community are all impacted. So it's hard for me to say what the definition is with just one sentence.
Oh, I understand.
Painting that picture and centering of justice in the process of that picture.
I appreciate that. I like that you pointed out kind of centering the victims and also like when you're identifying the harms, that you're looking at the harms of the victim and the harms of that offender as well. Finding out what are those harms and then how do we build around that. I think that's so important. And often even many of the people that we know that are incarcerated are also victims of some other crime. So this kind of dual victimization or wearing different hats is very common.
Yes.
So yeah, finding ways that we can center that. What are some of the practices that maybe you use in community as far as, is it restorative justice circles? Or I know we have a victim offender dialogue program that we do here in our office. But what are some of the restorative justice practices that you're utilizing?
Well, sorry about that.
Okay.
I turned my phone off. When I talk about the practices, I'm talking specifically about circles, where there's a facilitator or 2, where there are the people most impacted. So the person who is the survivor of the harm, person who has caused the harm, and those who support those persons. So for our definition of restorative justice process, it includes all of those things. Now there are restorative kind of like, if you look at the global sense of what does it mean to create space for restorative actions and activities, there are several. You know, any group process, any process that's addressing harm and helping people to remediate the harm and take accountability for it. But the specificity of restorative processes that support the specificity of restorative justice, you have the person harmed, the person who caused the harm, and the person's most impacted by that harm together, telling their stories, and determining ways to make it right, which is all about accountability. So restorative justice centers with the victim, but restorative justice also ensures that at the end of the day, accountability, how do we make this right? And in order to participate in restorative justice, a person has to admit that a harm was committed, that a harm was done. That commitment isn't there, there's no restorative justice. And everybody has to agree.
What are some of the, or can you give some examples of kind of how the harm was made right? Like what are some of those differences as opposed to, you know, incarceration, or even, I know sometimes these circles can happen after the person is finished with incarceration. And but what are some of those pieces for making it right that maybe the survivor then feels, oh, this feels like closure to me, or this brings me to a place of healing and resiliency? What are some of those pieces like?
So there's three different situations I can speak quickly on. One was someone who was a lifer without parole. He was dying, he had been incarcerated for 40 or 50 years. He was dying of cancer imminently. And the DA, district attorney's office, got a call from one of the people who was, who survived a really tragic mass shooting. And whenever someone's released, they have the opportunity, they have to let everybody know. So they let this gentleman know, and he said he wanted to meet with him. He needed to have a conversation to understand what happened. So we did a restorative justice circle around the man's deathbed, because the person that was 80 years old now that had survived that mass shooting, he just needed to know, what in the world were you thinking? And when it was all said and done, they were both in tears, and the gentleman that was dying, he died a couple of days later. The other gentleman said, at least when I go, I'm not carrying that pain. The other situation is we had a young man who assaulted a police officer. And he assaulted the police officer because he really didn't understand what the police officer was doing. The police officer was trying to help, but in helping, it looked like violence. So the man assaulted him to protect his girlfriend. That situation came our way because the police officers in their report noted that the man apologized. That's all it was. The man apologized. When that situation came to the DA's office, it was pulled out, and the police officer said they'd be willing for a restorative process. The man had been charged with assault of a police officer, which is a felony. And so we did the process. The young gentleman found out what the police officers were doing. When everything was said and done, how they made it right is they decided both parties felt they were harmed. One was punched, but the other one was traumatized. So what they decided was the trauma was caused by lack of information about what police do when someone is 302'd. So what they came up with was dual. They said, you know what? It'll help us and the community if everybody understands what you do. Somebody has a heart attack and somebody starts beating on a chest. We're not calling the cops because we know what's being done. We 302 someone, the officers come in on a rough, trying to help them get stable. We don't know that. So what they decided was there'd be a community meeting where they talk about what happened and help the community understand this is what happens when you 302 somebody. The charges were dropped against the gentleman. The record was expunged. We have had situations where someone has been sadly murdered, And we've had family members, mothers or fathers or family members to say they want a restorative conference, a restorative circle. And a lot of times in prison, we're getting ready to do one now up at Phoenix, because the person who lost their loved one needs closure. You know, why did this happen? And the person on the other side wants to say, this is what happened and I'm so sorry. And people will be able to move. You know, it doesn't bring the person back.
Right.
But in some of those cases, they do advocate for the person to have humane treatment on the inside,
Mhm.
because now they see a person and there's
Yeah. Very powerful. Do we have any questions from participants or any comments from anyone? You want to raise your hand or drop anything in the chat? We want to make sure that we acknowledge that. Okay, let's talk about, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say one more thing. I did write it in the chat, but we want to remember that restorative processes and restorative justice is indigenous. Our people have been doing it for a very long time. It's just that other people started writing about it, which is good, and quantifying it, which is good. But it is our process, the process of the heart. So we're not doing something new. We're shining light on the way human civilization has worked for a long time.
We appreciate that. Thank you for bringing that out. Let's talk a little bit about second chance legislation and what we mean by that, and what are some of those options that we have here in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, so I can speak to that. So like, as you know, people saw in the movie, like in Pennsylvania, we have pretty extreme sentencing laws when it comes to first and second degree murder. Like the only option is life without parole. No other option. We like to call it death by incarceration because it's more accurate. It's a more accurate description of what the sentence actually is. People are sentenced to die in prison, right? A lot of the time, like these are very young people that are going in. You know, these are people that are teenagers that are in their early 20s, who basically, like, you know, like the young man in the video photo got caught up in, you know, some kind of thing in the community. You know, we all know as teenagers, you know, we don't make the best decisions, but when you're growing up in a community where there is a lot of violence, certain things are normalized and you have different perspectives, and it's just a very complex issue, right? And so, and it's not to excuse the harm that's caused, right? But it's also just to shine a light on the complexity. These are not simple things. And so, like, you have a situation where you have all of these, you know, young people that are getting life sentences, sentenced to die in prison, and there's no other option for them to come out, you know? And so right now in Pennsylvania, we have a population of over 5,000 people who are serving life sentences without the possibility of parole. A lot of these people now are aging, they're getting older, and they're not the same people they were when they were 19 years old, 18 years old, 20, as you can imagine, right? You know, Rukia said just yesterday we were in SCI Phoenix doing a restorative circle, and like a lot of those men in that circle were doing DBI sentences, and really none of them should have been there. You know, all of them were just like kind, thoughtful people. There was an 87-year-old man who got denied commutation. It just like, it defies logic, to be honest. And you know, so we've created this situation where, you know, people like, you have, you know, prisons are turning into geriatric centers, and it doesn't make any sense. And so in Pennsylvania, the options that we do have are basically commutation process, which, you know, as was explained, is, you know, very limited. And basically, you know, the door was closed to commutation for a long time. Governor Wolf opened that a little bit. I believe he commuted about 50 people. But since then, like, I think there's only been like 3 people that have been released through the commutation process. And before Governor Wolf, there was virtually none. Prior to the constitutional change, there were hundreds of people who were released through that process. It basically served as a parole system for Pennsylvania. And that was when the prison population was a lot less than it is now. And so what we're trying to do is to create opportunities for parole serving second and first degree murder sentences after, 25 and 35 years. That's one of the bills that are under consideration right now. So we're talking about decades, and we're not talking about just releasing people. We're talking about we want them to be able to have an opportunity to be heard in front of the parole board. And so with this, we understand that there are going to be people who will never get out, right? They have to make parole. Parole is an intense process that takes 9 months. It's not easy. A lot of people do not make parole on their first go, but at least this would give people an opportunity. In addition to that, victim testimony is part of that process. And so they're allowed to comment on it. And, we're not trying to cut victims out of that in any kind of way, but, we do believe that people should have an opportunity to show that they've changed and show that, they can contribute to society. And we've seen this with the juvenile lifers. We've seen this. A lot of the men and women who have come out after that Supreme Court decision are now in our communities, and they're doing great work. And the recidivism rate is 1%. So it's just to show, it's not we're not keeping these people inside of prison for public safety. That's not, and so we got to kind of evaluate what we're prioritizing as a society, really. Because really, if there's no public safety utility to keeping these people in prison, then what we're doing is just basically revenge. So, and if that's what we're doing, then we need to be honest about it and not pretend like prison is for people's rehabilitation, because that's not how it's functioning currently.
Yeah, but very well said. And I think that's a lot of a big part of the challenge, and not to judge one way or the other, but I think some survivors do feel like they want revenge. And in all honesty, some things you can't pay for, you can't replace. If someone has been killed, no one's ever going to be able to make that right. There has to be another way where people can find a pathway to hope and healing, because no matter how much money or nothing, we can't give that back to you. So yeah, like you said, it's very complex, and there's so many different places that people can be on their journey, and we certainly want to respect and honor that, but want to make space, for all parts of the conversation. I think that's super important, and I believe that's what we're doing here. I see somebody has put some information in the chat for us about commutation in PA since 1971. Emily, thanks for doing that. We've had somebody else express thanks to you all. Karen says thanks for explaining this and providing this information, and she's hoping that the word gets out to more advocates in the community. So this is great. And again, just a reminder, if you have friends or people that you want to share this conversation with, we are going to post this up to our YouTube channel so that people can watch it and benefit from it. And then again, I want to ask you guys, as dual survivors or any survivor who's on who wants to comment on this, tell us what you feel are some other options or services that maybe should be available to crime survivors who kind of sit in this space where they've been a victim of a crime, but then they also have loved ones who are incarcerated. What are some of those pieces that we maybe are missing where we could add some additional services or respond, what can we do better?
One thing is, in as much it's a service that supports. I don't know how we can transform the workers within the public-facing workers within prisons who re-traumatize visitors, who re-traumatize family members every time they come to visit. What types of cognitive restructuring needs to happen within those who are public-facing Now, we know that a lot of work needs to be done with the folk on the insides who are working with our loved ones on the inside, but that's a low-hanging fruit of how do we shift who's in front so that family members aren't made to feel so terrible.
I like that one. I'll tell the truth, I don't even like to go and visit at the state institution. Sometimes I do on invitation, but I don't like the way it makes me feel.
Exactly.
So I don't like to go. And then yeah, I don't even like to go. So yeah, I get what you mean, that whole process of, and I got a badge.
Mm-hmm.
Fingerprinted in the badge, but that whole getting through the, oh yeah, that's a good point. Anybody else? What are some other services or options that we could try to make available for people who sit in this space?
I think specifically when it comes to young people, we need to think about, again, that loss of that parent, that loss of that provider figure, and figuring out what it is that we can do first for the mental health of these young people who are experiencing that loss. I know my cousin, his father went away for murder when he was very, very young. And again, because these things are happening in communities where everybody knows everybody, the stigma that was then placed on my cousin for the things that his father did, you know, you go to school and you're bullied, and you're too young to be able to process the impact of what this person did, but then like feeling guilty because this is my parent and I love them. So do I turn my back on them? So being able to really find and provide resources for again, those young people who lose their parents to the carceral system, because we talk about these cycles of trauma and violence, right? We talk about how if you have a parent that is incarcerated, how that can likely lead you to incarceration. But if we begin the practice and be very intentional about wrapping our arms in community and systemically around these young people, we may be able to break up some of these cycles, because a lot of times, again, there are services for the young people who are, you know, the co-victims, but the young person whose parent did something, or, you know, however this person ends up in the system, that life is just as important and those needs are just as significant, because these are still two very young individuals experiencing loss at different ends of the spectrum, but it is still a loss. So I think that is something that we should really think about, like, how are we caring for very specifically the children of people who end up facing these death by incarceration sentences.
Awesome. That is so true. Such a good point.
Yeah. I mean, I want to just like speak to like I would like to see like there to be like more opportunities for restorative processes to take place, like between people who have experienced serious harm and people who have done serious harm. And I think the system makes it really hard for that to happen sometimes. You know, basically like the only option that we have is that we arrest people and like we put them away, isolated from the rest of society. And a lot of people who are incarcerated don't even know that they you know, they can write a letter to, you know, the person that they have been harmed, and vice versa. I don't know if people who have been victims of harm know that they can ask for some kind of restorative process. And like, I think I've heard, like, just at the rally the other day, there was a mother who lost her son. She said the most healing thing that she was able to experience is being able to talk to the person that killed her son. And so I think if there was more, like, an easier way for like people to experience these dialogues, and like that was more part of the process, I feel like a lot of people would experience a lot more healing. Because like when you incarcerate someone, that doesn't take away the pain, nor does it like make the person accountable. Like a punishment and accountability aren't the same thing, you know. Like you can incarcerate someone and they can never reflect on what they've done, And the prison system in itself does not encourage truth telling. And so, like, you can incarcerate someone and they could never be accountable. You've just, warehoused them basically. But like, if someone is forced to face what they've done, that's true accountability. And so, yeah, I mean, I just would really, love to see like there's more of a process, like, of, for people to have those restorative conversations, because I do think that, causes more healing than, what we are doing now.
Great. I see Karen's put in the chat, maybe impact statements are great when utilized by both parties. I haven't thought about that. A big part missing in so many areas is keeping communication open and honest with everyone. Breaking barriers that the human nature tends to put up are in need of being taken down slowly, methodically, and equally for everyone to have the respect and rights that they are entitled to, known and given. Yeah, that's true. Sometimes if we let fear kind of be the motivating factor of what we're doing, it just doesn't get us where we're trying to go.
That leads me to talk about something we don't like to talk about, which is sex offenses. There is work being done now about the sentencing of sex offenders. And I say this as someone who has twice in my lifetime, I'm a survivor of sexual abuse. One was family member where I didn't tell nobody. And one was as an adult, young adult. And it was someone who was high-ranking someone at a nonprofit where I also did not tell anybody. So, but when I look at that, I also look at the fact that I wish that there was process, and I would not have wanted either of these gentlemen to be thrown away. So some of not saying anything was that I did not want them out of their families' lives. I wanted them to get help. I did not want them locked up behind bars, especially the family member. Fortunately, when I did tell family what happened as an adult, what happened as a child, fortunately, my family was supportive. But I never told anyone what had happened with that other person who's long dead now. But there are certain types of harm that's done that we are really cruel in handling, not realizing that it also, my silence was because of concern for the family member who I cared about and concern for this other person. But what that meant was I didn't get help, they didn't get help, nobody got help. And it's because we have such extreme, permanent lifetime Megans. So if someone who is 16 has a relationship with someone who is 24, and this actually has happened, and the family member, the 16-year-old, gets mad. I know someone who served 19 years and has a lifetime Megans because of his girlfriend who was underage, and the grandmother got mad. And it's not a bad guy. I'm not saying what the person did is good, but that wasn't someone that was going and grabbing a kid off the street from the mall that they didn't know. And most sex offenses are within families and communities. So how do we look at those laws, and how do we used to do a GD program for guys that were at J.J. Peters. And when we started doing it, because we found out they didn't qualify for anybody else's GD program. Yet they were out, they had done their time. We did this for about 10 years. No one was ever harmed. But they had a hard time getting a job. They did their time. Whatever that time was, they had done it. And we did follow safety protocols, which was fine. But it was like that one offense meant they had no life after that. And so sometimes people that are victims don't say anything and continue to be victimized because of the stigma and not wanting to, in that way, ruin the life of the person who's harmed them, especially when it's a family member.
Yeah. And I think that there's lots of research and information on that kind of nationwide that often it's not like the monster that the person doesn't know, but someone, especially when we're talking about child sexual abuse, it's usually someone that they do know. So finding ways to kind of safely let people come forward with that, and that there still be accountability. Yeah, that's super important.
I actually wanted to lift up another thing that I feel like we don't talk about enough when we talk about victimization. And Reverend Donna, you brought it to my mind. When we think about domestic violence, right? A lot of times that is not reported the way it should be. And I can speak to that myself. I often forget to include that in my survivor story. That was something that I experienced during my pregnancy and up until my son was 11 months old. And calling the police was never an option. It was never a thought for me to get my son's father arrested. With my understanding of young Black men needing, like young Black boys needing that father figure, like their dad in their life, like it was never an option, right? But I think again, more to the restorative like practices, like if there was a way for me to have bought that forward, because I also didn't share it with anybody. Like I didn't share it with my family for fear that, however my family would have responded. Didn't share it with his family because didn't know how I would be viewed or judged. But if there was a safe way where I could have come forward and that accountability, right? Like I have my support system and he has his support system, and there actually be some help that was provided, because the reality of this person's situation is I left quietly. And then it just set the scene for other people that, and I know this to be fact, have gone through the same thing with this person. So not that I feel responsible, because like you're a grown person and you're accountable for your actions, but because there was no accountability, because I kind of just left quietly and whatever story was told was the story that was told. But if there had been a way where it was brought to the forefront and addressed within a community of people who love us both, then you think about how my child's life is impacted, how his other children's lives are impacted, and the cycle could have stopped with me. But because when you don't say anything because you don't want to do the other thing, it does really interrupt that idea that accountability can be had. So really thinking about where we can develop restorative practices across the gamut, because we think about just physical violence in a way of like gun violence sometimes, but it is so many ways that violence shows up, and we need to really make sure that we have a model for people to be able to address this in-house, across the gamut, because again, I feel like it's been said, but I'll say it again, a lot of times in our community, because people don't trust the police and don't want to interact with the police, or they have that connection or relationship with a person, like the option shouldn't just be go to jail or do nothing. Like there has to be a number of things in between those two extremes, right? Because nothing doesn't feel good, and sometimes, like for some people, prison is the answer, and that's okay for them, right? But for some of us, like that's not the solution that we're looking to see, but we do need to have solutions, like.
Very well said. Thank you so much for that. And we're coming to a close. We're getting some other information has been dropped in the chat about some of the restorative justice programs that we have here at the Office of Victim Advocate, our Victim Offender Dialogue program, the Inmate Apology Bank. Got some comments about the difficulty of leaving incarceration and the need for positive and helpful reentry programming is so important. Our Resilient Voices speaking program for survivors. And just another thank you to the panelists for being a part of this discussion. So I thank you. I think it has been a very thought-provoking discussion, giving a lot of us who are on the call, who are victim service providers, some more things to think about in areas where we can grow and change and see some of those gaps that are clearly present in the service provision that is happening now. And hopefully we can continue to work together to fill those gaps. So thank you so much for being a part of this and for everyone who was in attendance. And again, this will be reposted on our YouTube channel. If you need to share it with a friend or go back and hear it again, it'll be there. But thank you all so much. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you.